it was the high priest. So the betrayal of Jesus by Judas was bought for 30 pieces of silver. But the question is, were the money changers the source of the claim that the Jews were the international bankers? The author Dan Brown wrote a book in 2003 entitled The Da Vinci Code, and this book stirred up a huge controversy because it alleged that Jesus and Mary Magdalene, a woman named in the Bible, were married, and that this marriage resulted in children being born. I will not spend the time to discuss this book and its comments except for this one. The documentaries on the cable television networks that were aired because of this book were discussing the evidence that it was members of the Knights Templars around the year 1100 who became the European international bankers. So if this is true, then the international bankers are not Jews. They are the Knights Templars, the grandfather to the Masonic lodges of today. So Henry Ford and Mel Gibson are wrong. Hitler was brought into the world by this conspiracy, and Hitler was taken out by this conspiracy. And it wasn't the Jews who took him out. It was the very conspiracy that brought him into the world that took him out. And that conspiracy is not Jewish. Now, what does it mean to be a Jew? For those who claim that a Jew is born of a Jewish mother, tell that to Henry Kissinger, America's Secretary of State at one time, who was born of a Jewish mother. But Mr. Kissinger can no longer call himself a Jew, because on June the 20th, 1976, Mr. Kissinger was formally excommunicated from Judaism. The Jews have a Supreme Rabbinic Court of America composed of 5 rabbis, and they are shown in this picture. They spent nearly a year investigating the charges against Mr. Kissinger, and on that day they pronounced a cherem upon him, which means a place where access is prohibited, where a person is to be denied access. So Kissinger can no longer visit a synagogue. That must mean that Judaism is a religion, not a race. That means you are Jewish not because you were born into the faith, you are Jewish because of what you believe. It has been reported that Sammy Davis Jr. and Elizabeth Taylor became Jews, and neither were born of a Jewish mother. So if you are Jewish and become a Luciferian, you have to renounce your faith. You are no longer a Jew, you have renounced your religion. Those who claim that this is a Jewish conspiracy found some lists of the names of the Bolshevik communists who took over the Russian government in 1917 during and then after the bloody Russian Revolution. That revolution murdered as many as 40 million Russians. They found that many of the names on the list sounded Jewish, so those who believed that the Jews were the force behind the revolution proclaimed that they were. Think about this. Just because someone has a Jewish-sounding name is not evidence that they are Jewish. So that does not mean anything. There was no proof offered that these men were Jews by religion. And even if these communists were Jews and assisted the communist revolution, they did not keep power for very long. A real problem to those who support this theory occurred after Joseph Stalin took over in 1927. He purged all of the old Bolsheviks out of the party by liquidating them, and then started the most anti-Jewish program in the history of the world. If there was a Jewish conspiracy in charge of Russia, why did they allow this to happen? Stalin ruled for about 26 years. If they were in charge, they should have purged Stalin, but they didn't. That tells me that if the Russian Revolution was a Jewish plot, they were not very effective. They couldn't keep control of the communist revolution, because after Stalin's purges, their day was over. This is Professor Antony Sutton, actually, perhaps the greatest researcher of all into the Russian Communist Revolution of 1917, and he wrote this book entitled Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, meaning the Communist Revolution in Russia. His credentials for researching this book are impeccable. He was also the author of a 3-volume series entitled Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development from 1917 to 1965. He also wrote the book entitled National Suicide, Military Aid to the Soviet Union. In his Wall Street book, he added an appendix entitled The Jewish Conspiracy Theory of the Bolshevik Revolution on pages 185 to 189, in which he discussed the Jewish question. He states the premise: there is an extensive literature reflecting the argument that the Bolshevik Revolution was a result of a Jewish conspiracy. More specifically, a conspiracy of Jewish world bankers. Generally, world control is seen as the ultimate objective. He then examines an article written by Winston Churchill, later the Prime Minister of England, in 1920, that has been used by those believing the Jewish conspiracy as one of the greatest evidences that it is real. This is what Mr. Churchill wrote in the Illustrated Sunday Herald, an England newspaper, on February the 8th, 1920. From the days of Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati, an anti-Christian secret society, in 1776, to those of Karl Marx, to those of Leon Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman, all identified communists and supposedly Jews by faith, this worldwide conspiracy has been growing. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century. And now this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people. Then Sutton addresses the quotation where Churchill argues that the international Jews had a great role in the creation of Bolshevism and bringing about the Russian Revolution. Sutton writes, he, meaning Churchill, asserts, contrary to the fact, that with the exception of Lenin, the majority of the leading figures in the revolution were Jewish. And adds, also contrary to the fact, that in many cases Jewish interests and Jewish places of worship were accepted by the Bolsheviks from their policies of seizure. Sutton then goes on to examine the writings of Henry Steed, another writer supporting the hypothesis of the Jewish conspiracy, and the State Department Decimal File 861 and other documents that list the names of the Jews who were engaged in the revolution. Sutton reviewed this information on page 188 and concluded, however, none of the above statements can be supported with hard empirical evidence. And he continues on page 189, there is no concrete evidence that Jews were involved in the Bolshevik Revolution because they were Jewish. The evidence suggests that the New York bankers who were also Jewish, had relatively minor roles in supporting the Bolsheviks, while the New York bankers, who were also Gentiles, had major roles. And then Sutton addressed the issue of the Stalin purges. He wrote this: "The proportion of foreign Jewish Bolsheviks, meaning the communists, involved falls to less than 20% of the total number of revolutionaries. And these Jews were mostly deported, murdered, or sent to Siberia in the following years." So once again, after Stalin's purges, their days were over. There has literally been hundreds of communist revolutions all over the world since 1917, and not one of them has ever been connected to a plot by the Jews. Robert Welch named 27 men he considered to be communists ruling their respective nations. And he asked his readers, "Do you suppose Mao Tse-tung of China was Jewish? How about Castro of Cuba, Betancourt of Venezuela, Kim Il-sung of North Korea, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, and Ben Bella of Algeria, and others?" And he asked the question again, "Do you really believe these men were Jews?" Not one of them was brought to power by a Jewish-led revolt like that which allegedly placed Lenin in power in Russia. So the question is, why is that? Why didn't the Jews plan these revolutions to consolidate their quest for world power? If you say that these leaders were brought into power by a secret Jewish conspiracy, what evidence do you have of that? As I have said, I don't know one person who believes in a Jewish conspiracy that has ever claimed that any of these communist revolutions were brought into power by a Jewish conspiracy. Perhaps the bloodiest communist revolution ever occurred in China between the years 1923 and 1949. Over 80 million Chinese were brutally murdered. And there is no one, including those who believe in a Jewish conspiracy, that claims the Jews were behind this communist revolution. The conspiracy that slaughtered these people did not give the Chinese people a government occupied by Jewish communists. There is not one Jewish conspiracy theorist that I know of who has claimed that Chinese communism was created by a Jewish conspiracy. It doesn't seem as if the leaders of this so-called Jewish conspiracy are very effective in controlling the world. And then Professor Sutton discussed the real reason there are those who believe in the Jewish conspiracy theory. The persistence with which the Jewish conspiracy myth has been pushed suggests that it may well be a deliberate device to divert the attention from the real issues and the real causes. What better way to divert attention from the real operators than by the boogeyman of anti-Semitism? So here Professor Sutton clearly identifies the motives of those who believe in the Jewish conspiracy. They intend on diverting the attention away from the real conspirators. If the real conspirators are not Jews, then who are the real conspirators? This is a book written by Alice Bailey entitled The Externalization of the Hierarchy. Mrs. Bailey was a supporter of the Luciferian conspiracy, and it was her intent to explain to her readers